In this lecture, we will expand our look at learning theory, now to incorporate in criminological circles the theoretical frame of reference known as social learning theory. Now, whether we are talking about learning theory as it relates to the work of the psychologist or social learning theory as it is applied in the field of criminology, there is a basic assumption that we have to make. That assumption is that behavior is generally learned. Now, when we looked at, in this case, personality theory, we realized that there are biochemical and psychophysical qualities as they relate to our biological development. There are qualities that are biological as it relates to behavior. But one of the things that we have to focus in on is that there's a strong environmental contribution to behavior as well. And like personality theory, there are other theoretical frameworks that are closely relatable to, in this case, social learning theory, and I'll mention two, and I think you'll see right away why they are closely linked. The first is strain theory, and this is a theoretical perspective that dates back to the work again of Emil Durkheim, looking at stress and how we respond to stress. And then the other school of thought that is closely linked to social learning theory and how we react to the cues of interactions around us is an ecological theory. So the idea that environment also contributes to how we may or may not react to a stress, how we may or may not react to a topic that helps us to survive socially, physically, so on and so forth. However, unlike these theories and unlike a traditional behavioral theory, learning theory does not emphasize performance, specifically individual performance. It is not necessarily the case that we have to act on a particular environmental stress or an internal stressor. It is, though, important that we have seen a reaction to a particular kind of stress in the behaviors of others, and that we have internalized this in some way, shape, or form. That's where learning theory, by definition, begins to pull away from a traditional behavioralist model. Now, behavioralism does work its way into the discussion that we have when it relates to behavior and learning. There are external and internal kinds of conditioning. There's classical conditioning, there's operant conditioning, which will incorporate the individual into the process. But conditioning and reinforcement are only pieces of the puzzle. It is not until we start to take into consideration personality, relating to things like emotion, and environmental circumstance that we can start to see the larger puzzle take shape. So reinforcement and performance are there, conditioning is there, but it is not it doesn't play as central of a role in social learning theory and its application as we would see in a traditional behavioral model. So it is not necessary to engage in all behaviors that we ultimately learn. We engage in the behavior only if we have incentives or motivations to do so. These are the ideas, in this case, of Sue Reed as she is describing learning theory. Motivation, she writes, may come from biological factors or from mental factors, the latter giving us the ability to imagine the behavior's consequences. So here is the kind of gray zone distinction between a traditional behavioralist model and a social learning model. She continues, and this is also important when we are trying to differentiate this theoretical framework from a more of a conditioning framework. She writes, learning theorists view consequences as the factors that influence behavior. So it's really the outcomes that are important to how social learning theory impacts or influences behavior. She recognizes three particular areas where these consequences take shape, or three categories of consequence. The first, we've mentioned this before, is external reinforcement or an external consequence. Things like money, social status, punishment for a particular kind of behavior. This is more external in nature. She recognizes vicarious reinforcement, or a vicarious kind rather of consequence. This would be, in a sense, reinforced by observing those around us. We see somebody participate in a behavior or an act, we see the consequence of that act, and in a sense, we are living vicariously through that person's conduct and learning that we should or should not participate in that kind of behavior or engage in that particular kind of action. And then the third and final category that she recognizes is self-regulatory. A self-regulatory kind of reinforcement or consequence category could be how we respond to actions in ways that bring self-reward or self-punishment. So these are situations where we may be self-deprecating in terms of how we package or reflect on a particular kind of behavior or action. Or we may reward ourselves by getting ourselves an extra meal at a local restaurant, or taking ourselves out for an evening to reward ourselves for following a particular line of behavior or not participating in an action that maybe would have gotten us in trouble. If we're the kind of person who is intensively judgmental and we finish statements with, well, I'm glad I didn't do something like that, this would be, again, more of that self-regulating reinforcement that Sue Reed is recognizing. And that also can be part of a criminological landscape, the idea that, well, I'm not going to participate in those particular kinds of behaviors because I don't want that to happen to me, or I don't want to be classified or categorized as that kind of person. So that's more of that third area of reinforcement that ties into social learning, that we are self-regulating. We don't want ourselves to be classified in a certain way, or we challenge ourselves to be classified as something like successful or wealthy. And this all ties into the idea that in the place of performance or direct action and consequence, learning theory or social learning theory focuses more on motivation and reinforcement. So the assumption that also lies at the heart of social learning theory is that reinforcement will influence behavior. So we have to start looking at what is required for social learning to occur. Ronald Akers and Christine Sellers, in their overview of Edwin Sutherland's differential association theory and their larger description of social learning theory, identify 9 important pieces to the puzzle, and we'll go through a few of those as they relate to this idea of learning. First, they identify that criminal behavior is learned, and we already touched upon that in the introduction to social learning theory. Second, criminal behavior is learned through interaction, generally with other persons, and is reinforced by the process of communication. Third, Akers and Sellers identify, along with Sutherland, that when we have criminal behavior being learned, it is occurring in more intimate personal groups. So it is in those areas associated with the process of socialization that are most intimate to the individual, things that are probably most closely associated with early childhood development. Fourth, when criminal behavior is learned, there are 2 components. There are techniques that are associated with committing a crime that are being learned, and then the specific direction of motives, or the drives, the attitudes surrounding a particular criminal activity are a second part of what is being learned. So the techniques, or the means, and the motivation for doing that are both being learned. Fifth, they recognize that the specific direction of motives and drives is learned from definitions of the legal codes as favorable or unfavorable. So the idea here is that the motivation, the drive to act in a particular way, and how that action relates to the larger definitions that the society is assigning to it, the legal code, for example. These are also being learned. Sixth, a person becomes delinquent because of an excess of definitions favorable to violating the law over definitions that support not doing so. So the next piece of the puzzle is that the motivations and drives that are being learned in those more intimate circles in the process of socialization, many of these will be connected to more unfavorable kinds of practices, or things that will actively violate the law versus things that will actively be used to model the upholding of the law. Seventh, differential associations may vary in frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. So differential associations, those things that are again being modeled for us in the world around us, as Sutherland points out, will vary. They'll vary by frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. Eighth, the process of learning criminal behavior by association with criminal and anti-criminal patterns involves all of the mechanisms that are involved in any other brand of learning. So the process of learning a criminal behavior will mirror the process of learning really any other behavior. So we are, in a sense, approaching criminal behavior and the learning of a criminal act and the modeling of that criminal act as we would any other behavior that we are being socialized into. And then ninth, although criminal behavior is an expression of general needs and values, it is not explained by those general needs and values, because non-criminal behavior is an expression of the same needs and values. So the idea here is that criminal behavior is not common to the overall consensus that a society has on how we act on need and value. It is being supported by another brand of need and value as it is expressed in those more intimate social circles. So again, Sutherland and Akers and Sellers are connecting the dots here with regard to how we learn and ultimately how criminal behavior is learned. And what we find is that the requirements for learning, whether it is an act or a behavior or associated with an action or a behavior that is considered to be favorable, is the same with some exceptions. Frequency would be one of them, to a behavior that is being considered criminal in nature. We can learn a good behavior, we can learn a bad behavior in the same manner. And so the requirements of both, generally human social requirements, are the same. So what is reinforcement? And what makes reinforcement in relation to social learning theory different from conditioning as it relates to a behavioralist model? Well, we know that at the basis of that difference is the idea of performance. We do not have to necessarily perform the act to learn the motives, directives, consequences, and social values that underpin a criminal act. So that's really the principal difference here. Well, reinforcement appears both as the result of individual growth and development, so things that we gather as we develop our personalities, and in terms of social interaction. So as we are further socialized, reinforcement will occur as well. Who then are the agents of socialization, or where are these areas where socialization occurs, and where is the socialization most intimate? Well, let's start with the agents of socialization. First, and probably the most intimate, is the family. Our families help us to develop not only a sense of identity, but Our family equips us with an understanding of the social roles that we may have or may play based upon biological structures, and the family models those particular roles for us. As we move out to a less intimate area, but still something that is pretty pretty important in terms of daily interactions, the neighborhood or where we live. Beyond that, we have things like religion. That's an agent of socialization. Daycare, or where we receive care outside of the home. This could include public forms of health care. The school setting becomes an agent of socialization. Peer groups within school environments, within neighborhood environments, these become agents of socialization. And then as we grow into our adulthood, we have the workplace. The workplace becomes another important area of socialization. Now, beyond these agents of socialization, we also have messages. And communication, as we have identified in terms of social learning theory, is also very important. In fact, it goes hand in hand with, in this case, the associations that we make with people around us that further help to instruct us as to what roles we should have and what behaviors we should participate in on a regular basis, whether good or bad. Well, the messages that we receive that are also socializers include messages from popular media or mass media, things like television. We see also messages being shared with us with regard to more interactive kinds of media environments. Video games definitely are reinforcing and sending out messages. Music, that would be another area. Of course, movies would also reinforce some of this as well. And then, of course, mass media as it relates to written material. So visual elements that we take from, in this case, magazines, newspapers, things like this. So all of these become messengers of socialization and will, in a sense, reinforce some of the values and practices that eventually become part of our adult life. There can also be situations in which we are re-socialized. That is, we can learn new norms in a sense. Or as the society itself shifts in terms of some of the social values that are commonly held by, and sentiments that are commonly held by society in general, we can readapt to some of these as well, and we are, in a sense, re-socialized in that process. And all of that comes with its own level of reinforcement. So reinforcement, as it relates to the process of socialization, can be a lifelong practice, and it's something that can even be incorporated into systems of control where we have a person who, let's say, participated in a behavior that was seen as antisocial through not only counseling but also even, in this case, public initiatives with regard to physical care or physical health and mental health. A person can be, in a sense, re-socialized. They can be given a new set of normative behaviors by which they can then regulate their own behaviors. So reinforcement, and to a lesser extent classical or operant conditioning, if we're to kind of reach over into the behavioral school of thought, these are things that are extremely important with regard to providing us with an explanation as to why we are behaving the way we are. So reinforcement may be internal and voluntary, but it can also be environmental, and that's why I said earlier in the lecture that environmental theory is also something that we can closely relate to social learning theory. And then finally, and this kind of connects everything that we've discussed thus far, and then definitely connects social learning theory with the process or the processes rather, of socialization, the definitions that a group or a society assigns to behavior or to a series of behaviors that are either seen as favorable or unfavorable, these also will contribute to the process of reinforcement. So, as Ronald Akers and Christine Sellers point out, there are many levels and many components to social definitions that we have to step back and look at because, again, the definitions in themselves will be active within the process of reinforcement. So we have things such as more general definitions. These would include some of our primary agents of socialization and some of the social values that are attributable to their actions. So things like a religious school of thought would tie into more general definitions of right and wrong. Things that would be associated with an individual's natural sense of morality would be more general in nature. And then you have definitions shared by a society that are a little more specific in nature. These would be more tied to um, how a society reacts to and codifies things like law as they relate to deviance or deviant acts. So, things that we have specific laws against would be more specific definitions. And these are things that are shared with us as we are generally educated. So, as we are introduced to the judicial system, to constitutional law, things like this, as we are growing and developing, and as we are taking courses, let's say even in elementary school, having to do with American history, these more specific definitions are being introduced to us. But then, mass media, agents of mass media, the messages that are shared there with regard to criminal justice can also socialize us very early on with regard to specific definitions. And then within each of these major categories, we have positive definitions, negative definitions, and things that are a little more neutral in nature. So a negative definition would be something that is directly relatable to the root of or the nature of a criminal behavior and how that is being defined. Positive definitions would be things that would be associated with an attitude or a belief that's reinforcing an overall positive or favorable behavior or activity, something that is seen as morally correct. And then we have more neutral definitions, things that are kind of falling in either a transitional category, things that are shifting as the culture and its overall sense of social behavior and value, um, as that is shifting, a more neutralized or neutral definitions will ultimately pop up and will eventually fall into a positive or negative camp. Um, or others will always be a divide within the larger society. So, how a group of people within the society looks at an action or a circumstance, and how others may fall on one side or the other of that. Some people may paint it more as trending toward a positive behavior. Others would see it as trending more toward a negative behavior. So, something like abortion, for example, as it is falling on the books or falling off the books. This is a situation where the circumstances that surround the decision that a person is making might be viewed in a positive sense or a negative sense, or the outcome itself might be viewed as legitimate, while others may view the outcome as illegitimate. So, again, this would be part of more of a neutral area for how a society is defining behavior. And so all of this has to be taken into consideration when we're looking at reinforcement and how reinforcement is playing a role in the process of social development, socialization, ultimately the learning process for an individual at all ages. Right? As we are in our early development, as we're really getting a sense of abstract thought, and ultimately our personality is developing, and then once we're into our early adult or adolescent and early adult years, how those social values, how those norms are being reinforced over time, And then as the society is changing itself, because society and ultimately the culture that is underlying the society and its structures, how that is changing over time, and as we are re-socialized as part of that process, these definitions and these reinforcements then will play a major role in how our attitudes continue to change. Um, One last example, the topic of marijuana and the legalization effort that is occurring state by state across what is today the continental United States, that the attitudes that we have toward a controlled substance like marijuana has changed. And we are starting to see a re socialization occurring as it relates to that. And one of the things we have to then step back and do as sociologists is look at some of the neutralizing definitions that can be associated with that and how aspects of that uh, controlled substance now are seen in a negative light still, or now are being seen in a positive light, and how that, in a sense, that specific definition as it relates to a controlled substance is changing over time, and how that will have larger implications as to how young people are being socialized into how they may be looking at not only that drug, but the role it plays in the lives of people. So, again, we can see in this case how values continue to change as the culture itself continues to change over time.